Every year, the world eats more than 100 billion servings of instant noodles. They ride in the backpacks of students and the ration kits of soldiers. They have been carried up mountains, stocked on submarines, and, in 2005, launched into orbit, so that an astronaut could eat a bowl of ramen while circling the Earth at 17,000 miles an hour. It is one of the most widely consumed foods ever created, cheap enough for the emptiest kitchen, familiar in almost every country on the map. The man who made it possible spent most of his life being told he was finished. By his late 40s, he had been jailed. Twice. He had watched a company he built dissolve into bankruptcy, and then, in the space of a single year, everything else was stripped away. His savings, his reputation, the fortune he had spent decades assembling, leaving a man that the people around him had quietly begun to write off. Too old, too disgraced. Too late. His name meant 100 blessings. For most of his life, it read like a joke told at his expense. This is the story of how a broke, dishonored, middle-aged man walked into a wooden shed behind his house, with no laboratory, no scientific training, and no good reason left to believe that anything would ever work out, and spent a year chasing an idea that everyone else was certain was impossible. This is the story of Momofuku Ando, and it begins, as these stories often do, not with the invention but with the ruin that made it necessary. He was not born Momofuku Ando. He was born in 1910 in Taiwan, which at that time was a colony of the Japanese Empire, and his given name, written in Chinese characters, was read as Momofuku, 100 blessings. Ando was a name he took later, from his wife, in a country that would spend decades treating him as an outsider, no matter what he built. His parents died when he was young, and he was raised by his grandparents, who ran a small textile shop. It was there, watching merchants come and go, that he absorbed the first lesson of his life, that a person with nothing could still trade their way into something. He was a natural entrepreneur, restless, quick, allergic to the idea of working for anyone but himself. As a young man, he started a textile company of his own, and by his 20s, he had money, ambition, and the particular confidence of someone who has never yet been truly broken. Then came the war. And the war broke almost everyone. Here the record gets tangled, and it is worth slowing down because the popular version of Ando's life compresses this chapter into a single tidy sentence. He went to prison for tax evasion. And the fuller truth is far stranger than the summary. Ando was jailed not once but twice. The first time came during the war years. According to Japanese accounts, he was accused of diverting military supplies onto the black market, a serious charge in a nation under total mobilization. The second came after the war, in 1948, when he was arrested on charges of tax evasion. By his own telling, the money in question was not hidden income at all, but scholarships he had been quietly paying for students in need, payments that the authorities of the time chose to treat as fraud. He spent time behind bars, some accounts say close to 2 years, and here is the detail that the recycled versions almost always leave out. In the careful Japanese record, both prosecutions eventually collapsed. He was released. The charges in the end did not hold. There is a strong suggestion in the sources that take his life seriously that his real offense in the eyes of certain officials was simpler and uglier than any of the paperwork, that he was a conspicuously wealthy, Taiwan-born businessman in a defeated, starving country that was hungry for someone to blame. We should be honest about what we can and cannot know here. Ando is not a neutral narrator of his own life. Every man who writes his memoir is the hero of it. But the pattern across independent sources is consistent enough to state plainly. He was imprisoned, the cases against him were shaky, and he walked out with his name damaged and his businesses in pieces. Whatever the legal truth, the human truth is not in dispute. He entered the post-war years marked as an ex-convict, and in Japan in 1948, that mark did not wash off easily. Most men would call that the bottom. For Ando, it wasn't. The bottom was still 9 years away, and when it came, it would arrive not from a courtroom but from a balance sheet. By the mid-1950s, Ando had done what he always did. He had rebuilt. He had climbed back up through a series of ventures, salt, prefabricated housing, whatever the ruined economy would pay for, and by his mid-40s, he was, once again, a wealthy and respected man. He had even taken on a position of public trust, chairman of a credit union in Osaka, the kind of local financial institution that ordinary families depended on to hold their savings. And then, in 1957, the credit union failed. It went bankrupt underneath him. And because he was its chairman, because his name was on it, because he was the man the community held responsible, The collapse did not just cost him a title. It cost him nearly everything he personally owned. When the accounts were finally settled, Momofuku Ando, who had twice made himself rich from nothing, was left with a single asset, one modest rental house in Ikeda, on the outskirts of Osaka. That is the moment the title of this story points to. Not a metaphor, a ledger. A man in his late 40s, twice jailed, publicly disgraced, sitting in the one building the wreckage had left him, with a wife and a family and no fortune, no company, and no obvious way back. He had spent his entire adult life proving he could rebuild, and now he was being asked to do it again, older, poorer, and more tired than he had ever been. He would later put a single sentence to this period, one that has since been quoted in kitchens and boardrooms around the world. In life, he said, it is never too late. At the time he said no such thing. At the time there was only the shed. Behind the rental house in Ikeda stood a small wooden work shed. It was maybe 10 square meters. It had a second-hand noodle-making machine, a pot for boiling oil, a wok, and very little else. It was not a laboratory. Ando had no training in food science, no chemistry degree, no research team, no investors lining up to fund a 50-year-old ex-convict's hunch. What he had was a memory and a problem, and time he could not sell to anyone else. The memory came from the immediate aftermath of the war. Japan was starving, the United States was shipping in wheat flour by the ton, and the government was urging people to eat bread. But bread was foreign to most Japanese, and it puzzled Ando that the authorities kept pushing loaves on a country that had eaten noodles for centuries. When he asked why, the answer he was given was that the nation's noodle makers were too small and too fragile to feed a whole population. They simply couldn't produce enough, fast enough, cheap enough, to matter. And there was another image he could not shake. From those same years, long lines of people standing in the cold outside black market ramen stalls, waiting an hour for a single hot bowl. He watched them, and he thought about how much they wanted it, this warm, familiar, deeply human thing, and how hard it was to get. So the problem defined itself. What if a bowl of hot ramen didn't require a shop, or a cook, or a wait in the cold? What if anyone, anywhere, could make it themselves, instantly, cheaply at home? What if the noodle could be made to keep for months on a shelf, and come to life again with nothing but boiling water? Everyone he mentioned it to told him the same thing. It couldn't be done. Fresh noodles spoiled in a day. Dried noodles turned to glue or gravel. The very idea of a noodle that was cooked, preserved, stored for months, and then perfectly restored in 3 minutes with hot water violated everything anyone knew about how noodles behaved. He set 5 conditions for himself, and he refused to compromise on any of them. It had to be delicious, it had to be cheap, it had to keep for a long time without refrigeration, it had to be simple enough for a child to prepare, and it had to be safe. Then he walked into the shed and started to fail. He failed for the better part of a year. He worked 18-hour days, sleeping 4 hours a night. He made noodles, seasoned them, dried them, tried to preserve them, and watched them fall apart. The flavor was wrong, or the texture was wrong, or they rehydrated into mush, or they cracked into powder. The central puzzle, how to dry a noodle so completely that it would keep for months, yet leave it so porous that hot water could bring it all the way back in minutes, resisted him at every turn. He tried and threw away batch after batch. His family ate the failures. They ate a great deal of failed noodles that year. The breakthrough, when it came, arrived from the least scientific place imaginable, from his own kitchen, watching his wife cook dinner. This is the part of the story Ando himself loved to tell, and it deserves the small caution that comes with any origin tale a man repeats for 50 years. It is polished, and polished stories are rarely the whole picture. But the technical logic behind it is sound, and it is what the record supports. He watched his wife make tempura, watched her lower battered vegetables into hot oil, and watched the water inside the batter burst into steam and boil away, leaving behind a crisp, dry, porous shell riddled with tiny holes. And there it was, flash frying. If he steamed the noodles to cook them, then dropped them into hot oil, the frying would drive out the moisture almost instantly and leave the noodle shot through with microscopic tunnels, dry enough to survive on a shelf for months, hollow enough for boiling water to race back in and restore it in minutes. The very tunnels that let the water out on the way to preservation would let the water back in on the way to a meal. It worked. In 1958, in that shed at the age of 48, Momofuku Ando produced the world's first instant ramen. He called it Chicken Ramen. Chicken Ramen. It went on sale on the 25th of August, 1958. The man who had lost everything on a balance sheet the year before had, with a wok and a borrowed idea from a tempura pan, invented an entire category of food. Success did not arrive gently, and it did not arrive uncontested. When Chicken Ramen first appeared, it was not cheap. It cost several times more than a portion of fresh udon from a shop, and retailers were skeptical of the strange dried brick that promised to become soup. Ando had to convince a nation that this was not a gimmick, but the future of the dinner table. But the product had something no marketing could manufacture. It delivered exactly what it promised. Hot ramen, at home in minutes, from a package that had sat on a shelf for months. For a country still rebuilding, still counting its yen, still remembering the lines in the cold, that was not a novelty. It was a small miracle you could hold in one hand. It sold, then it sold more, then it became a phenomenon. And almost immediately, as happens with every good idea, the imitators swarmed in. Competitors flooding the market with cheap knockoffs, cutting corners Ando had refused to cut. His response tells you who he had become. Rather than simply sue everyone, he pushed the industry toward standards and quality controls, and in 1964 helped found an association to hold the entire instant noodle business to a common bar. He had spent his life being treated as a man outside the rules. Now that he had built something, he wanted rules, but he was not done, not close. In 1971, at the age of 61, an age when most people are counting down to retirement, Ando invented the product that would carry his noodles across the entire world. The story he told about its origin is, again, part fact and part burnished legend. So take it in that spirit. On a trip to the United States, he watched American buyers, who had no bowls and no chopsticks, break his noodles into paper cups, pour hot water over them, and eat them with forks. Whether the flash of insight was quite that cinematic, the result is not in doubt. He redesigned the entire product around a single waterproof container, a cup that was package, cooking vessel, and bowl all at once. He engineered the noodles to suspend in the middle of the cup so they'd cook evenly. He put the seasoning right in. He called it Cup Noodles, and with it, instant ramen stopped being a Japanese product and became a global one, sold on every continent, adapted to every palate, a fixture of dorm rooms and disaster kits and midnight kitchens everywhere on Earth. Momofuku Ando stayed the chairman of the company he had founded in that shed until he was 95 years old. He is said to have eaten his own instant ramen almost every single day of his life, and he liked to point out, with some satisfaction, that it had kept him healthy into old age. He died in 2007 at the age of 96. Today, the company he built sells on the order of 100 billion servings a year. There is a museum in Ikeda, on the very ground where he lost everything, dedicated to the shed and the man and the noodle. Visitors can stand in a reconstruction of that 10-square-meter workshop and see with their own eyes how little he had when he began. And this is the thing worth sitting with before the credits roll. We tell the story of Momofuku Ando as an invention story, and it is one. But strip away the noodles and look at the shape of the life underneath, because the shape is the real lesson. He was jailed twice and cleared. He went bankrupt and rebuilt. He climbed all the way back to wealth and respect and a seat of public trust. And then, at an age when the world had already decided his best years were spent, he lost it all a second time, down to a single rented house. He did not invent instant ramen despite that ruin. He invented it because of it. The idea did not come to a comfortable man. It came to a broke, disgraced, exhausted man in his late 40s who had nothing left to protect and nothing left to lose, who had been knocked down so many times that getting back up had simply become the only thing he knew how to do. The ruin was not the obstacle in his story. The ruin was the raw material. His name meant 100 blessings. For most of his life it looked like a lie. And then, in the one building the wreckage had left him, an old man decided it was never too late, and made it true. That is the whole idea of this channel, in a single life. That the thing you build after you've lost everything is often the only thing worth building at all. That being broke is not the end of the story. Sometimes it is the shed where the story finally begins, built from ruin.